Good morning. Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. 2 weeks ago, we got through most of John chapter 4. Jesus leaves Judea and he goes up to Galilee in the north, and as he's on his way up there, he stops in a town of Samaria, and he sits down by a well, and he ends up having this long interaction with a woman that he happens to meet there. Jesus deliberately reaches out to teach her about the kingdom of heaven, and he shares his own living water with her while she is at the well trying to draw water for her household. And so what happens is that these scorned half-breeds, as the Jews would have seen them, half-breeds both genetically and religiously, respond to the gospel in a way that the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem and the religious elites had not. They had rejected him. They had rejected Jesus and his teaching, and yet Jesus goes on to these people who should have been far less prepared, and they're the ones who really respond to the gospel. Well, that brought us up to almost the end of chapter 4, but there was a little bit left. At that point, Jesus is leaving Samaria, and he is heading all the way up to Galilee in the north, and we're going to finish out chapter 4 this morning, and then we'll also go all the way through chapter 5 too. John chapter 4, verse 43. After the 2 days he departed for Galilee, for Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his own hometown. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, having seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the feast, for they too had gone to the feast. Okay, well, we didn't tackle a whole lot to start, did we? But there's already a lot going on here that's worth some attention. We're being set up so far to see this three-tiered model of preaching and response in the different regions. We've got Judea, and we've got Samaria, and we've got Galilee. He is rejected in Judea, he is accepted in Samaria, and now he's in Galilee. And we're left asking, what do we expect? What's going to happen? Well, Jesus primes us already. In verse 44, Jesus had testified that a prophet has no honor in his own hometown. And so Jesus doesn't have particularly high expectations. He doesn't think this is going to go all that well. But then in verse 45, immediately after that, it says that the Galileans welcomed him because they had seen all that he did in Jerusalem at the feast. So it seems like it's going better than expected. This is a bit confusing that it says a prophet gets no honor in his own hometown, and then it says that he is welcomed in his own hometown. So what's going on here? Well, there are 2 points to make about this. The first is that the other Gospels do tell us that Jesus had left Nazareth about this time and moved to Capernaum. And it's possible that that's involved, but I kind of doubt it because John doesn't make any mention of it. It's more probable that it just has to do with Jesus' expectations and limitations of the welcome that these people are giving him. He expects to be rejected to some degree. Now, he's actually welcomed, but why? Why is he welcomed? Well, we're told in verse 45 that they welcome him because they saw all that he had done in Jerusalem, because they were there too. Well, what had he done in Jerusalem for them to see? What had he done that left such an impression on them? It was the miracles that he performed. Well, that's something, but it doesn't exactly rise to the same level as the Samaritans that Jesus had just been teaching. As far as we know, he didn't perform any miracles there. He just taught them. The closest thing that came to miracles was displaying his supernatural knowledge. And I mean, that's something, but it's nowhere near on par with performing these great healings and the sorts of things that he's going to be doing later on. And yet, the Samaritans believed him primarily because of the words that he spoke. And so here he is in Galilee, and these people welcome him, but they welcome him not because of his teaching. They welcome him because of all that they had seen that he did down in Jerusalem, because of the miracles that he performed. Now that's something, but it's not enough. And this impression meshes pretty well with what he's going to say about the crowd a little bit later. Let's get into reading again in verse 46. So he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And at Capernaum there was an official whose son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." The official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. As he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, "Yesterday at the 7th hour the fever left him." The father knew that that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." And he himself believed, and all his household. This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee. It's a little bit odd that Jesus says that this man won't believe, and yet he clearly does believe. And John tells us that just a verse or two later. Well, there's something else going on here. In verse 48, when he says, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. Well, in Greek, that you is plural. So he's not talking only to the man in front of him. He's talking to that man. I mean, it says in verse 48, Jesus said to him that you will not believe unless you see these signs and wonders. But the you is plural. He's talking to the crowd. He's talking to everybody, and in particular, this man who has asked for help in healing his son. Now, this could come across as a little bit heartless coming from Jesus, where he says, this man comes up and says, "My son is dying." He says, "Oh, you always require signs of me. You never believe unless I give you a sign." No, that's not entirely accurate. Based on the reaction that he is already getting, Jesus is saying, well, here's your chance then. This is what you have asked for. You guys have been asking for a sign. Well, here's your sign. We can see actually in verses 50 through 52 the sort of stratification of belief that we don't always quite acknowledge. Because they, the crowd, they really just don't believe. They don't really get anywhere. And Jesus says that clearly, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And then he, the man, the official whose son is sick, he does believe. We're told that directly. But then he also checks. When he's on his way home and his servants come and meet him and say, "Your son is better," he doesn't just rejoice and say, "Well, Jesus was right." He says, "Oh, when did it happen?" So he's kind of checking on it. He is testing what belief he has. He doesn't have an implicit 100% blind faith. Instead, he has a kernel of belief, and now he is trying to validate that. And then, after he has found that out, he believes again, is what it says, that he believed and his whole household. So it's as if at first it was not a full measure of trust, or he would have just assumed that things lined up exactly as Jesus had said. But the investigation into his kernel of belief ended up confirming it and strengthening the belief that he already had. Now that perhaps is a comfort for us when we have minor doubts or when we face confusion and we have a lack of understanding of the things that we read and the things that we're told. We should investigate as well. We should investigate and reflect. Paul says something about this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5:21. He says, "Test everything, hold fast what is good." And that's the approach that we ought to take. But of course, we have to make sure that our definition of good is an objective one and not just whatever seems good to us and whatever makes us happy. Well, that brings us to the beginning of chapter 5. Let's start reading in verse 1 and we'll get down through the beginning of verse 9. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. So from the beginning, there are a few questions that we should ask, like, for instance, what exactly is this pool? Well, I can show you. You'd be very surprised at just how difficult it is to get a well-drawn map of Jerusalem that doesn't run into some sort of copyright issue. So you're stuck with my horrible hand-drawn rendition here, but you can at least see where these pools are. The pools of Bethesda, just up to a little bit to the north and east of the Temple Mount. Verse 7 shows us that there was at least some belief, whether it was accurate or not, that the waters of these pools had some sort of healing powers. Whether or not there's any legitimacy to that, obviously that's why these people are gathering there. They're hoping to be healed. And this particular man has been there for a long time and has not gotten anywhere. And so Jesus comes and he is able to provide something that is far better Now, clearly, what he has done here to heal this invalid who's been paralyzed for 38 years, well, I mean, no one could possibly be upset about what he has done here, right? Middle of verse 9, "Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, 'It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed.' But he answered them, 'The man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk.' They asked him, 'Who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk?' Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, 'See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you.' The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, 'My Father is working until now, and I am working.'" Well, that seems a bit petty, doesn't it? They're really upset with him over the day on which he healed this guy. This was a great release for this guy who had been healed. He had been, stuck in this very difficult situation for 38 years. And so, in a sense, Jesus is providing him rest on the Sabbath day. And yet the Jewish authorities are very upset with both of them for this happening. Now, the law of Moses makes it very clear just how seriously they are supposed to take the Sabbath, but, I mean, the guy who's doing the healing is in charge of the Sabbath. He's the one who made up the Sabbath. He came up with it in the first place. Surely he has the authority to suspend it from time to time, right? Well, maybe it's just that they don't believe that's who Jesus is. They don't believe that Jesus is behind the Sabbath. But certainly they should be able to see that his power is from God. If he's going around healing invalids all the time, doesn't that count for something with them? Well, no, it doesn't. They're just mad that he isn't abiding by the rules that they would like. They clearly have a lot of audacity to come to this person who has this sort of divine power from heaven that they don't possess, and to say, you have no right to do this on the Sabbath day. Ironically enough, they're mad at him for speaking a few words, but they don't mind walking around, finding him, working to enforce the law, expending a whole lot of effort and words. Well, now Jesus has a response for them and says, "My Father is working until now, and I am working," and that's going to get him in trouble. In fact, John says that is the source of their persecution of Jesus. Verse 18, "This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." So Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. The Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life." Now, from their perspective, it seems like they have a legitimate gripe here. They ought to be a little bit concerned because, if some random guy is claiming to be God, then, that's a pretty big deal. But they're not adequately considering the evidence before them. How can this random guy, if that's all he is, how can he heal people the way that he does? They're willing to pass over that and assume that he has no authority to do what he's doing. How many people even talk the way that Jesus is talking? Now, that doesn't count for everything, but how many can talk like that and yet remain consistent? This is special. This is different. How many people who are claiming to be the Son of God are as servile as Jesus is being? Usually, that sort of person is out to exalt oneself, but that's not what Jesus is doing. He is working in humility and self-sacrifice. That alone should be enough for them to pause and reconsider what's going on here. Well, now we have the speech that Jesus makes here, and Jesus is pointing them to the Father. It's much like the man who he had healed said, look, if you've got a problem with me carrying my bed, maybe you should talk to the guy who healed me. Well, Jesus is doing the same thing. If you've got a problem with what I'm doing, maybe you should talk to my Father. All I'm doing is following his example. He's never stopped working. He's constantly doing good things, and I'm just trying to follow his example. If you have a problem, maybe you should take it up with him. He also talks about the authority that his Father has vested in him, and that as well is going to get him in trouble. But if that's true, if that's really the case, then it certainly has some implications for these people that are accusing him, that they ought to take him a little bit more seriously. And of course that has some implications for us as well, that we ought to take him seriously because the Father has given him all authority. And then he moves on into predicting things. He moves on into predicting things like resurrection. Now, of course, he is speaking somewhat metaphorically there. He's speaking about spiritual life, at least at first. But by the time he gets down to verse 24, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. He is tying spiritual life to an eternal life, to something that is beyond the here and now. Well, he goes on, starting in verse 25. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself, and he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. So in verse 25, he begins with the same language that he was using back in chapter 4, verse 21. Chapter 4, verse 21, when he was talking to the woman of Samaria, and he says, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. And he says something similar in verse 23, the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Now here in verse 25 of chapter 5, he says, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Well, now clearly he's back to talking about the spiritual. Metaphorically, he's talking about those who are spiritually dead in sin, and yet it also has larger implications, those who are physically dead. He ties it again to the promise of eternal life. And yet, while it's tied to eternal life, it's also tied to an eternal judgment. He spoke about it before, but it wasn't all that clear. Now he says that the dead will rise and be judged. And some of them will be given life, and some of them will be given over to judgment. Now that is a euphemism for punishment. And if the reward is eternal, then we would assume that the punishment is eternal too. He goes on even further, verse 30. I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. There is another who bears witness about me, and I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true. You sent to John, and he has borne witness to the truth. Not that the testimony that I receive is from man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. He was a burning and shining lamp, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. But the testimony that I have is greater than that of John. For the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you have never heard, his form you have never seen, and you do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe the one whom he has sent. You search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me, yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. I do not receive glory from people, but I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory and honor from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? He starts here with another expression of humility to say, I can't do anything. Everything that I do comes through the Father. And then he moves on to talking about testimony. This is one of the big themes in John's Gospel. He introduced it all the way back in chapter 1, and it's popped up a time or two since then, and it will show up several times again. Testimony, bearing witness, it's such a big deal. He convicts them and says that they should believe him by now. Well, how can he say that? That's a pretty stark claim to say, you should believe me, even though he admits that if I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true in verse 31. Well, how can he say that and then say that they ought to believe? Well, because his own testimony, while it doesn't mean a whole lot to them, is not all that they have. Anyone can lie and would have a vested interest in doing so, but he's not alone in the testimony that he's given. In verse 32, he says there is another that has given testimony. Who is that? Who is the other that has borne witness to him? Well, in verse 33, he identifies that person, John. John the Baptist is who he's talking about. And he knows that they took him at least somewhat seriously. Back in chapter 1, they sent messengers to him and said, who are you? And said, what are you doing? He also knows what John told them. He knows that John told them, I am not the Christ, but that the Christ was coming. John told them the Christ was coming soon, and that he was there to prepare the way. Verse 34, he says, not that the testimony that I receive is from man, but I say these things so that you might be saved. Okay, so even that guy's testimony, even John's testimony, isn't all that big a deal, but at least they did have it. The question is, what did they do with it? Now, Jesus kind of slides right past it here, but we know from Matthew and Mark and Luke that John the Baptist was executed for no good reason. Now, we don't actually know exactly when that happened on the timeline as far as John's gospel. We don't know exactly how to mesh those two together, but by this time, John is clearly either in prison or he is dead. And Jesus is softly lamenting that fact, both for John's sake and for the sake of those who should have been paying closer attention to John and to Jesus. But it wasn't just Jesus saying this about himself, and it wasn't even just John saying this about Jesus. It goes beyond that. There's something even greater. In verse 36, the testimony that I have is greater than that of John, for the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. So the miracles that he performs, those bear witness to who he is. Those are testimony to his divine origin. So how else would they have known if they had never heard God's voice? Well, through the words that he had given. In verse 39, he makes it clear what he means there. He says, you search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. So the Scriptures testify. That's the Old Testament that he means, of course, especially the prophecies in the Old Testament. They testified about Jesus. So we've got this whole slew of witnesses. We've got Jesus himself, but he recognizes that that doesn't mean a whole lot. He's also got John, which means a little bit more. He's got the miracles, and he's got the Scriptures. Now he's trying to recall the principle from the law of Moses that everything must be established on the word of 2 or 3 witnesses. He clearly matches up to that standard. He even exceeds that standard. They ought to believe by now. They ought to be taking him seriously. And yet they don't. Verse 43, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. Well, why would they do that? It's because Jesus was not what they wanted. He's not what they were really looking for. They wanted somebody who was more charismatic, someone to behold. They wanted someone who was militarily and politically powerful and educated and elite. They wanted someone like them. And Jesus just wasn't that. And so instead we have in verse 45, Jesus says, do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. He's not even here to defend his own honor. He's not even here to go to his dad and say, these people don't listen to me. He says, look, that's not my problem. Moses has already taken care of that. Moses already accuses you before the Father. They claim to revere and follow Moses and his teachings, and yet Moses and his teachings point to Jesus, and they have rejected him. That's a sad indictment of these people. They're seeking to kill him because he's not what they expected. He's not what they wanted. You know, there are lots of people today who want to believe and can't quite bring themselves to do so. Often these people find themselves in a position of asking God to give them a sign, as if they're willing to believe, they're amicable to the notion, but it just doesn't quite pass the threshold. It doesn't quite rise to their standard of belief. And so God, if you would just give me a sign. Well, when people do that, they think that they're being humble, they think that they're submitting to God, but really they're putting him to the test. Really, they're rejecting all of the vast testimony that God has already given them. In chapter 4, verse 48, back when Jesus said, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe," he didn't say that approvingly. He wasn't recommending that approach. That's an arrogant approach. It's an implicit accusation against God that says, you're asking too much of me. And I'm the one apparently to sway God, not the billions of others who have wrestled with these questions for thousands of years. We all want to try to maintain our own sovereignty and maintain some independence from God. But true submission to his power and his will and his authority means a surrender. And you can't surrender and yet reserve the right to make further demands. God's not asking for a blind or unreasonable faith. He has testified at great length to the things that he wants you to believe. And if you refuse to believe, that doesn't really make him all that mad so much as it makes him sad, so much as it disappoints him. Because we already stand condemned. That's what Jesus said back in chapter 3, verse 18. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And we could also throw in Romans chapters 1 through 3, where Paul goes to great lengths to demonstrate that we're all guilty. Jesus has made his case once again to these elites, and he's given them another chance. Time is passing, and he is delivering this message or versions of it, not just once, not just to one crowd, but over and over, to group after group of people that are rejecting him and accusing him and ignoring John and Jesus' miracles and the Scriptures. This message that they have been rejecting, it matters just as much to you and me as it did to them. Jesus has been patient, and he's given you all of the time and resources that can reasonably be expected. He's demonstrated who he is, and now the ball is in your court. So the question is, will you acknowledge his authority or not? If not, then don't think that your decision is going to hurt him any. It'll only hurt you. But if you will acknowledge his authority and surrender your life to him, then, well, that brings about salvation and joy, both for you and joy for him. And we'll talk more about this in future episodes. I'd encourage you to tune in again. If you'd like to talk further about these things, to study more what Jesus has said, if you need help with spiritual matters, then I'd encourage you to get in touch with us at the River Ridge Church of Christ. I hope that I have made you think this morning, and I hope that I have shared something worthwhile with you. I am Jeremy Nettles, and this has been Iron Sharpens Iron.